Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vaga Muradian here in Northern Virginia with Bryan McGrath, noted naval writer, naval officer, former commanding officer of the USS Bulkley. Bryan, thanks very much for joining us.
My pleasure, Vaga. Thank you.
You've taken a look at all of the reports so far, the report, accident investigation into the Fitzgerald crash, the McCain, John S. McCain collisions that claimed the lives of 17 sailors. Admiral Phil Davidson, commander of Fleet Forces Command, has done his own exhaustive assessment of the 4 incidents since the beginning of the year, the Antietam, Lake Champlain, and then obviously the 2 that were the deadly collisions. Talk to us a little bit about what your takeaways were. From your professional naval eye, what did you see that was interesting? And most importantly, do you see this as a systemic failure, as some regard it, or do you just regard it as commanding officers who made bad calls?
What I saw in the reports was what I expected and what I hoped for, which was brutal honesty. The Navy pulled no punches with itself. Obviously, I think 10 officers of the rank of commander all the way up to 4-star have had their careers truncated as a result of these accidents. The findings in the comprehensive review are comprehensive. They go from the training of enlisted sailors all the way up to the maintenance of the force and the operational load that was placed on it. So I think the comprehensive review pointed at a number of important systemic issues, and I'll get back to that in a second. The actual reports of the accidents themselves were, as those reports always are, again, brutal. It is impossible not to read those reports and come away, especially as an experienced mariner, with a clear sense of who was at fault and what the degree of responsibility was. So I'm actually proud of the Navy for the degree to which it came forward with these reports. Now, as to the question of systemic issues, I believe that the comprehensive report reinforced the fact that there are deep systemic readiness problems in the Pacific Fleet, specifically in FD&F Japan. Those readiness problems existed quite apart from the tragic deaths of 17 sailors and should have been known and acted on all along. The tragic deaths of those sailors, however, has shined a light on these problems. The problems, the readiness problems themselves, if you look for a clear causal chain between them and these accidents, I think you'll be frustrated because there isn't a clear causal chain. What there were on those 2 ships are negligent professional mariners who knew better and did not perform to the standard that they knew was the standard. And it'll be interesting to see what comes of the UCMJ and Admiralty investigations that go forward from here. I believe that to the extent that the larger issues did have an impact, it was on diminishing the secondary ways that you keep these things from happening. The communication between the bridge and combat, for instance. But primary responsibility rests with the 2 commanding officers, and in the case of the Fitzgerald, especially on the officer of the deck for that officer's, I believe, negligence.
And that was in the Fitzgerald case, right? Was the particular thing, the disconnect between CIC and the bridge, and then the confusion that happened. In the case of McCain, when we were talking just before the interview, you made the case that you think actually what happened to Fitzgerald may have been a causal factor in the chain that caused the McCain tragedy. Talk to us about why you think that.
I don't have any inside information, but when I looked at the reports, the report on the McCain, and I read that the commanding officer the day before, after the navigation brief, that he was advised by the senior leadership of his ship, the executive officer, the operations officer, and the navigator, to set a higher condition of seamanship readiness called the sea and anchor detail at 0500 in the morning. because of where the ship's track said it was going to be in the Strait of Malacca. And he said, no, we'll hold off until 6 so the crew can get an extra hour of sleep. After the Fitzgerald collision, social media and the news media was rife with speculation as to whether exhaustion played a role, and every junior officer with a Sailor Bob account talked about how it was exhaustion and we don't get any sleep, and while I agree that there are situations in which ships don't pay enough attention to circadian rhythms and exhaustion, Fitzgerald had been underway for about 24 hours at that point. If you're exhausted after 24 hours, I don't understand that Navy. But putting that aside for a second, I think the captain of the McCain learned the wrong lesson from all of the stuff that was out there in social media and the press. And he said, no, we'll let them sleep for another hour, when he should have been thinking, I want the varsity on watch during that demanding time.
We spoke also to Jan von Toll of CSBA, the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, another experienced commanding officer, commanded 3 ships while he was in uniform, a minesweeper, a destroyer, as well as an amphibious assault ship, and somebody who's known as a naval thinker clearly in his own right. His concern was whether or not the Navy might overcorrect because of this. Is that your sense? Well, what do you think? What do you think? If you were advising Secretary Spencer and the CNO, two-part question. What are the 3 things from where you see, because you still have a lot of sources that are out in the fleet, you still get out and about and are still engaged in naval issues. What do you think are the top 3 things or 2 things that they should be paying attention to?
There are 2 things that really bother me. One is that the relentless cutting of staffs over the last 20 years, and especially, I would say, in the last 10 years, has led, in my view, to a situation in which we don't have a layer of command above the level of the ship itself that has enough people and enough time for those people to regularly get back out on those ships and reassess their competence and professionalism. We do these grand certification events, and we say, yes, verily you are qualified, and then we come back 2 years later. I believe it wasn't that way when I was a kid. You had an oppressive level of command called the readiness Desron above you, who was constantly in your knickers and testing and looking at you and making sure you were ready. And I think we've cut into the bone at that level of command. We need to get back to a position where somebody, lieutenant commander or above, and a little team of people comes out and crawls around your ship once a quarter and is looking at your competence and your professionalism and reporting back to someone empowered to weld you to the pier if what they find is unsatisfactory. That's number 1. Number 2, I am concerned that the average 30,000-ton commercial vessel trucking around the oceans has a better bridge equipment integration lash-up than we have on our ships. We spend our money on combat systems. We spend our money in sensors and weapons. We don't spend our money on the kinds of systems on bridges that feed watchstanders quality information, quality integrated, curated information. The CNO talks about that the commercial traffic scene has increased by 400% since he came in 1982. It is a more demanding environment, but our bridge equipment hasn't kept up with that demanding environment. So I would like to see integrated bridge watch standing aids that not only take the input from the radars and electronic warfare and AIS and all of the other tools, but then makes recommendations, algorithms that think through this terrible level of traffic and says to the officer of the deck, you should slow to 12 knots, you should you should come left 30 degrees. It gives the officer of the deck those kinds of recommendations. That technology's out there. That technology needs to get into the fleet.
Is bridge standardization an issue? That's come up in part because prior classes of ships had remarkable standardization or significantly more standardization until the Burke class, where every sub-block of Burkes had a slightly different layout. Many different opinions on it, but I wanted to get your take on that, whether you think sort of total standardization may be a better way to go on that.
It seems to me that ship control should be treated as a commodity, and that commodity should be supplied to the Navy in a manner in which its configuration is controlled, and there is a tight level of responsibility on the industry partner to provide this capability to the ships, and that when you go from one ship to the next ship to the next ship, especially when they're of the same class, you ought to be able to count on those suites, those navigation suites, being the same. So I think standardization is a good goal. I don't know whether standardization has to become the goal over all others, but it is a good goal.
Overcorrecting, which was, I think, Jan's concern, and where I started on my earlier question before I sort of, distracted myself from the question. Are you concerned at all that the Navy might learn the wrong lessons from these episodes?
No. I'll worry about overcorrecting when I see the rudder over and the corrections beginning. I think the direction that Admiral Davidson and his team came up with, I think the entire Navy doesn't see those as recommendations. They see that as an action plan, and I think the right people are going to get working on it. There is a lot there that can be done without any resources moving. There are very important things that will have to have resources behind them. It'll be interesting to see in the 19 budget whether those resources are available. That said, I will take my chances with overcorrection. I'd like to see the corrections begin before I worry about that.
Let me ask you about the RFP that was released. The Navy has put out the request for proposals on the frigate version or its future frigate. A lot of competitors in it. The Littoral Combat Ship will be one of the competitors of design in that. What do you think the attributes should be for this new ship? What do you think, by way of range, by way of payload, by way of capabilities, do you think a multi-mission frigate for the United States Navy should have?
Well, I think you made the right distinction here. This is a multi-mission frigate. It ought to be able to defend itself and a ship in company from a sophisticated maneuvering missile threat. It ought to be able to kill submarines, but with a sophisticated anti-submarine warfare suite and the weapons to do so. And it needs to be able to kill other ships over the horizon. And I mean dramatically over the horizon. We haven't built a ship in the United States Navy that can kill another ship since 1999. That is terrible, and we need to turn that around. I am concerned in the frigate, in the frigate, the FFG competition. I'm concerned about, obviously I'm concerned that the ship can be built with lower technical risk. I would like to see a ship built that is already being built here in the United States. I don't have a lot of faith in designs that I haven't seen. I haven't walked around on any of the potential foreign competitors. I have nothing against foreign ships in general. I just can't say that I have been on those ships and seen them. So I want to keep the technical risk down. I want this ship to be a ship that can be built in numbers for a reasonable price, because numbers matter, and we need to get some ships out there. And I think that is where the Navy is going with this RFP. RFP is just for a design. I think what it does is it throws some money around to a handful of shipbuilders to mature the designs that they have.
I think it's like $15 million each.
$15 million a piece, I think.
A piece. Is that a call on your part to take a closer look at the patrol, the frigate version of the National Security Cutter?
I think that has to be one of the. I think frigates derived of parent designs from the LCSs. I think the National Security Cutter is a very important entry into this field. I think that's sort of where we should be going with this.
Very good. And I forgot to tell you that you also lead FerryBridge consultancy, which I should have said at the very top of it. One of the proposals that Secretary Spencer has floated to increase force structure, a whole variety of things. First, try to bring back into service ships that have been mothballed. Then do service life extension programs, whether on the Ticonderoga-class cruisers or on even Los Angeles-class attack submarines, or even consider doing so with Virginia-class attack submarines. One of the proposals he has is to take a look and see whether or not up to 10 Perry-class frigates that have been relatively recently retired should come back into service. What do you think about that plan? Because when I interviewed him, I asked him whether or not that had all been costed out. What do you think about that idea?
Well, I'm a big fan of extending the service life of the cruisers and the LA-class submarines that the submarine community believes have life left in them. I am not a fan of this idea to bring FFG 7s, 10 FFG 7s out of the boneyard, I think for a period of 10 additional years. And I hear the Secretary talking about this, and he almost always lays it off against the anti-drug mission. First of all, when I think about a rising China and an aggressive Russia, I find myself wondering why we would spend $1 on ships that are part of the, out there doing the drug enforcement mission. I understand it's important, but I believe we have the forces available in CONUS that are in various states of readiness that can go do that. I don't know what it would cost to take 10 of these ships out and then man them, people them, start the supply chains again that would serve those ships, start the training courses again that would send trained sailors to those ships. I don't know what that would cost. My guess is it's between $2 and $10 billion over 10 years. And that's it's at least 2, and it's probably no more than 10. Bottom line for me is there's a lot better places money can go in our Navy than bringing out very, very limitedly capable ships to do a mission that I don't think is core to the U.S. Navy. I would rather see money like that going to DDG modernizations to bring more ships up into the full ballistic missile defense capability, which we see in the 7th Fleet is a major stressor of force structure. I'm looking at opportunity cost when I say these things. When it comes to the 350 ship Navy, nobody has argued for that more than I have. But the bottom line is you want it bad, you get it bad. And if we bring ships that, when we were putting them away, there were horror stories of being able to push your finger through the hull, through the steel on the hull at the waterline, then that have been sitting there for 10 years with no protection against seawater corrosion at all. I just don't understand why we would do that.
How do you respond to those people who actually blame the services for some of these readiness challenges and problems? And on my podcast last week, folks were basically saying, look, the military services chronically are budgeting for amounts they're not going to get. So instead, they budget for what they would like to get as opposed to what they're actually getting, and perennially are running out of money, which is one of the things that contributes to the readiness challenge. Does everybody need to be a lot more realistic about how training dollars and readiness resources are being expended, and instead of being Pollyanna that you're going to end up getting a lot more money that you're never going to see?
I've been around Navy HQ for a long time, and I just haven't seen that as a budgeting habit of the U.S. Navy, whether from HQ or out in the fleet. I see money meticulously tracked. I see you have stuff that you have ships that collide, and you have to find money to do things. You have ships that have incredible engineering casualties that have to be fixed. Stuff happens, and if being realistic means creating some sort of a relief valve or a head tank of money that you could use to pay those bills, well, that may make some sense, but I don't think Congress is particularly interested in giving the Navy that kind of a slush fund, nor do I think the Navy ought to have it. I think the Navy does a pretty good job of estimating its capability to do maintenance and training. The problem is that they have underscoped that because they believe they're going to get less money. They're budgeting to what they think they're going to get. And God's honest truth is the Congress always gives them everything they ask for. So to the extent that there's any place where the services are to be folded, it's within the Pentagon. It's within the budget process that results in that budget, because Congress wants to give the Navy more money. They want readier ships. They want more ships. They want better trained people. The Navy just has to ask for it, and you can't ask for it by yourself. You have to ask for it as part of this big DoD bill, and that's where the problem comes in.
Does the Navy need culture change when it comes to warfighting? That was something that John Greenert, when he was Chief of Naval Operations, made the case warfighting first, and it became his 3 bumper stickers. But there are folks who look at the Navy and say, the Army, and you and I have talked about this, the Army and the Marine Corps, have engaged in combat periodically, whereas the surface force has not really traded steel since World War II. In many, many respects. I mean, there are certain select applications, and you served with distinction on your ship and did some extraordinary things with it that were not typical, or a little bit atypical. But do you think that a broader cultural shift is needed, especially for the surface force, at a time when we're looking at a much, much more contested environment at sea, where you can make the case that at least the submariners have been engaged in very real-world operations, and they've been stepping up the op tempo there for much, much more real-world missions, which is what they've done. Naval aviators, not as much in contested environment, but certainly been practicing. How do you see that? I mean, do you think that that is a challenge for the surface force in particular?
So a couple of years ago at the Surface Navy Association, the Surface Force Commander, Admiral Roden, gave a speech, and he referred to Andrew Gordon's book, The Rules of the Game, about the Battle of Jutland, and more importantly, about the decline of the Royal Navy from the end of the Napoleonic Wars right up. It's 100 years. And Gordon uses this beautiful phrase that the fleet, the Royal Navy, floated in the long, calm lee of Trafalgar. And Roden asked the question, have we been in the long, calm lee of Leyte Gulf? And what I believe is that the surface force has been changing its culture. The surface force created out of whole cloth this concept of distributed lethality, where they said that they were going to work to make every ship more survivable and more lethal. And that by increasing the lethality of those ships, they create more mischief for the other guy. The other guy has to spend resources on keeping track of newly empowered and powerful ships that they don't have to worry about right now. And so there was this, Roden used to use these phrases like going on the offensive, taking to the offensive. And there was a little bit more of a spring in the step of the surface warfare community as we saw things like, SM-6 in the surface role coming out. We saw Tomahawk Block 4, where you had Tomahawk as an anti-ship weapon, where we had a lot of work being done about more important ways of targeting and providing targeting information to ships. NIFCA, with the Naval Integrated Fire Control Counter-Air, that lashes up an Aegis ship and an E-2 and a standard missile. These are things that the surface force really has been pushing and pushing and pushing. So I think that cultural change is underway. I think it's relatively recent, probably since 2014 or so. And I just hope and pray that these accidents don't arrest that development. That has to continue. This move to the offensive has to stay as part of it. We have to make, whether it's the Chinese or the Russians or the Iranians or whoever it is, we have to make them wake up every day and say, today is not the day, because the force that's there is powerful. They can take a punch and then deliver offensive power in return. And I think that's where the surface force was going, and I hope it stays that way.
Do you think these accidents have taken the bloom off the Navy's rose? And because the CNO has also said, I want everybody going to bed thinking, what a problem we're going to be for them. Do you think that the accidents diminishes or tarnishes that reputation for combat efficacy?
I think that, especially China, and I've seen this already, are using these accidents as part of their propaganda campaign to sow that doubt of our partners in our capability. I don't think our partners and our allies and our friends wonder about how good America's Navy is. America's Navy is still pretty damn good, and I would take us in a scrape with anybody. It's not even close. That said, there are problems that need to be addressed, and Admiral Davidson's report is a great start on that. I look forward to seeing some money moving in the direction of the surface warfare community in order to address these training needs and these maintenance needs and these readiness needs and modernization needs. But I think there are places within the Navy where I just want to stop. I'm talking too much right now. That's bad. Yeah.
All right, last question. Yep. SWAS in a box, bad idea. Do we need to have SWAS for division, surface warfare officer school for division officers, something that they can go to before they report to their ships? Or do you think that issue has been overwrought, that guys are doing the coursework? Because, Jan von Toll, others, friends, right? You only do about 2 weeks of ship handling in that, or coursework. Most of it is boiler a whole bunch of fundamental stuff that you have to know to become a division officer, as opposed to the driving of the ship part of it.
Yeah. When I commanded my ship, the officers that came to me came directly from their commissioning sources. They came with good attitudes, and they came with an armful of CD-ROMs. And it was then my responsibility as commanding officer, as it always was, to make sure they were trained and ready to do their jobs. It was easier to do that job as commanding officer, training your junior officers, when there was what I had, which was a 6-month school in Newport, Rhode Island, that went through fundamentals and systems and ship handling and combat and all of those things. I came to the ship with far more education. Surface warfare was considered more of a profession in 1987 than I think it was in 2005. There were some decisions made in the mid-aughts that I think were just silly. It was the triumph of efficiency over effectiveness. The Navy has turned the corner on some of those things. There are portions of that 6 months that have been reborn in the fleet concentration areas, and all the division officers go through those things. I just don't think it's enough. I think that 6 months at Surface Warfare Officer School in Newport, it was a wonderful time to baseline all of your junior officers and to give them a set of tools that they could then go out into the fleet with. I think we need to go back to something like that. We need to take this profession in a professional manner.
Bryan, thanks very much. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to talking to you again, especially after Admiral Roughhead and Michael Baer put out their report in a little while.
I look forward to reading that too.